Today, we are covering a breaking development that represents a terrifying new frontier in international conflict. The border between the United States and Canada is no longer just a physical line defined by checkpoints and customs officers, it is rapidly transforming into a digital firewall. In a severe escalation of ongoing bilateral tensions, the Trump administration has officially launched what analysts are calling a content war against its northern neighbor, citing unfair trade practices and the targeting of American technology giants. Washington has announced a sweeping series of punitive measures aimed directly at Canada's digital, cultural, and entertainment sectors. Within hours, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney fired back, unequivocally defending Canada's digital sovereignty and signaling that Ottawa is fully prepared to retaliate. We are no longer just fighting over steel, lumber, or auto parts. This is a war over the flow of information, the survival of domestic culture, and the multi-trillion-dollar digital economy. How did the deeply integrated North American media landscape fracture so violently? What are the conflicting red lines driving this digital trade war? And most importantly, what does this mean for the creators, consumers, and the fundamental concept of an open internet? Let us dive into the facts. To understand the roots of this unprecedented content war, we must examine the historical precedent of Canadian cultural protectionism. For nearly a century, Canada, a nation of roughly 40 million people sitting directly adjacent to the most dominant cultural exporter in human history, has utilized government regulation to protect its domestic media. From radio quotas in the 1970s to strict broadcasting rules in the 1990s, Ottawa has historically forced traditional broadcasters to fund and showcase Canadian content. However, the rise of the internet and the dominance of American streaming giants fundamentally disrupted that carefully managed ecosystem. Over the last few years, the Canadian government attempted to bring the digital realm under federal jurisdiction. Ottawa implemented controversial legislation, most notably the Online Streaming Act, forcing American platforms like Netflix, YouTube, and Spotify to financially contribute to the Canadian broadcasting system and algorithmically promote Canadian creators. Concurrently, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government stubbornly moved forward with a unilateral digital services tax, or DST, levying a 3% tax on the local revenues of massive foreign tech conglomerates. To Washington, these policies are not acts of cultural preservation, they are direct, illegal attacks on American corporate supremacy, and a blatant violation of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. This brings us to today's breaking escalation. Following a rapid Section 301 trade investigation, the Trump administration declared Canada's digital policies to be openly discriminatory. In response, President Trump did not merely threaten standard tariffs, he weaponized the digital economy itself. The White House has announced a multi-pronged offensive. First, the administration is imposing crippling tariffs on all physical exports tied to the Canadian entertainment sector, a direct strike at Hollywood North, the massive film and television production hubs in Vancouver and Toronto. Second, the administration has threatened to revoke the intellectual property protections of Canadian broadcasters operating within the United States. Most aggressively, Washington has floated the unprecedented idea of applying regulatory pressure on American internet service providers to throttle or geo-block Canadian state-funded media platforms across U.S. networks. The rhetoric out of Washington is uncompromising. The United States Trade Representative argued forcefully this morning that the internet was built on the principles of free trade and free speech, and that Canada is attempting to build a protectionist digital toll booth to extract billions of dollars from American innovators. From the perspective of the Trump administration, this is a necessary defense of the America First doctrine extending into cyberspace. If the United States allows Canada to heavily tax and regulate American tech platforms without consequence, it sets a dangerous precedent that the rest of the world will eagerly exploit. But across the border, Prime Minister Mark Carney has adopted a fiercely defensive and remarkably unapologetic posture. In a televised address from Ottawa this afternoon, Carney stated, "Canada is a sovereign nation, not a digital colony." The Prime Minister argued that American tech monopolies extract billions of dollars in advertising and subscription revenue from the Canadian market while contributing virtually nothing to the civic or cultural infrastructure of the country. Carney's government maintains that a digital services tax is not discriminatory. It is simply a mechanism to ensure that multinational corporations pay their fair share in the jurisdictions where they generate their profits. Furthermore, Ottawa views a regulation of algorithms not as censorship, but as a necessary equalizer to prevent Canadian voices from being completely drowned out by a tidal wave of American content. To counter Trump's aggression, Carney is not backing down. He has ordered the Canadian tech sector to begin preparing contingencies for a splinternet scenario. Furthermore, Ottawa has subtly threatened to weaponize its own advantages, hinting at potential export restrictions on the highly specialized tech talent and critical minerals that Silicon Valley relies upon to manufacture its hardware. As with any geopolitical conflict, there are two distinct, colliding narratives at play here. From the American perspective, Canada is breaching the spirit of free trade. Critics of the Canadian government point out that the internet thrives on borderless exchange. By forcing algorithms to prioritize content based on a creator's passport rather than the viewer's actual preferences, Canada is artificially manipulating the free market. Furthermore, American officials argue that a unilateral digital services tax undermines the OECD's global tax framework, creating chaotic, fragmented tax laws that stifle global innovation. From the Canadian perspective and the perspective of allied nations watching closely, the United States is acting as an imperial cyberbully. Canadian officials, alongside cultural advocates in Europe and Australia, argue that free trade in the digital realm is often just a euphemism for American monopolies, operating entirely unchecked. If an American corporation controls the platform, the algorithm, and the monetization, smaller nations have no choice but to regulate those platforms to ensure their own cultural survival and democratic integrity. But beneath the high-level policy debates, we must focus on the profound human impact and the devastating economic consequences of this digital trade war. Behind the political theater in Washington and Ottawa, millions of everyday citizens are about to be caught in the crossfire. Consider the independent Canadian content creators, the YouTubers, streamers, and digital artists who rely heavily on American audiences for their livelihoods. If the United States follows through on throttling Canadian IP, or if American platforms alter their algorithms to penalize Canadian content in retaliation, an entire generation of digital entrepreneurs could see their businesses wiped out overnight. Furthermore, consider the physical entertainment industry. The film and television sector in Canada employs hundreds of thousands of workers, from unionized camera operators and set builders to visual effects artists. The sudden imposition of tariffs on this industry will result in massive capital flight. Major American studios will simply relocate their productions to domestic states like Georgia or New Mexico, instantly triggering mass layoffs across British Columbia and Ontario. For the average consumer, this content war will be felt in the wallet and on the screen. Streaming subscriptions are virtually guaranteed to become more expensive as tech companies pass the cost of digital taxes and retaliatory tariffs directly onto the user. Consumers may also face geo-blocking, suddenly finding themselves locked out of their favorite platforms, news sites, or digital services simply because of the side of the border they reside on. This brings us to the sweeping global implications of this crisis. The world is watching this North American standoff with intense scrutiny. The European Union, the United Kingdom, and nations across the Indo-Pacific have spent the last half-decade drafting their own legislation to rein in the power of American big tech. They are utilizing tools like the Digital Markets Act and news media bargaining codes to claw back digital sovereignty. If President Trump successfully uses brutal economic coercion to force Canada to dismantle its digital regulations, it will send a chilling message across the globe. The United States will ruthlessly crush any nation that attempts to regulate American tech monopolies. Conversely, if Mark Carney successfully defends Canada's policies and withstands the economic pressure, it will provide a blueprint for the rest of the world to follow, accelerating the global fragmentation of the internet. This leaves us at a critical, defining crossroads in the history of the digital age. This is no longer just a trade dispute. It is a fundamental battle over who controls the infrastructure of the 21st century mind. This leaves us with a set of thought-provoking, urgent questions for you, our viewers. First, is the United States justified in using aggressive economic retaliation to protect its tech companies from foreign taxes and regulations, or is Washington weaponizing its economic dominance to maintain an unfair, unregulated monopoly over global media? Second, does a nation like Canada have a fundamental right to regulate the internet and force tech giants to fund domestic culture, or do these policies inevitably lead to censorship, higher costs, and the destruction of the open internet? And finally, as borders go up in cyberspace, are we witnessing the permanent end of the World Wide Web, replaced instead by a fragmented, nationalized splinternet where your digital rights are dictated entirely by your geography? We want to hear your perspective on these incredibly complex and vital issues. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's get a thoughtful, critical conversation started. If you appreciate factual, deep-dive political journalism that looks at every angle without the sensationalism, please hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you never miss an in-depth report. Until next time, stay informed, stay critical, and keep asking the hard questions. I am your host, and this is Politique News.